For more than half a century, his music has echoed across generations. Now, in 2025, Jimi Hendrix is once again lighting up the world. A legend who never really left us, Hendrix's name is on everyone's lips. And for good reason. Washington State has finally given him its highest civilian honor, a moment fans have waited decades for. At the same time, stages across America are roaring back to life as the Experience Hendrix Tour returns bigger than ever. Some of the biggest names in music are lining up to pay tribute. And in a move no one saw coming, blues icon Buddy Guy, fresh out of retirement at 88, is stepping back on stage for one final emotional performance. Jimi's fire, his spirit, his sound, it's all surging back into the spotlight, stronger than ever. This is the story of how Jimi Hendrix changed music forever, and why the world can't stop celebrating him now. Jimi Hendrix's story didn't begin with stardom. It began in the shadow of hard times, in a small home in Seattle, Washington. Born on November 27, 1942, James Marshall Hendrix came into a world already marked by instability. His parents, Al and Lucille, were young, struggling, and often at odds. Money was always short. Fights were common. Love was there, somewhere, but it was tangled in hardship. While his father served in the army, Jimi's early childhood was marked by separation. His mother, just a teenager herself, was left to raise him amid mounting challenges. Things got so rough that some of Jimi's siblings were placed into foster care. For a short time, even Jimi was sent away to live with a family friend in California. When Al returned from military service, he took his son back to Seattle, but the wounds from those early years never really healed. In 1951, Al and Lucille divorced. Jimi, along with his brother Leon, stayed with their father. Their mother drifted further out of their lives. In 1958, when Jimi was just 15 years old, Lucille died from liver disease. Al didn't allow the boys to attend her funeral. Instead, he handed them bottles of whiskey and said, "This is how men deal with pain." That harsh lesson would stay with Jimi for the rest of his life. It was around this time that music became more than just a dream. It became his refuge. Long before he ever held a guitar, Jimi was known for carrying around a broomstick, pretending it was an instrument. It wasn't just a game. It was an early sign that music was a part of his soul, waiting to be unlocked. A social worker noticed his obsession and suggested the school help him get a real guitar. But nothing ever came of it. Instead, fate stepped in another way. In 1957, while helping his father clear out a woman's home, Jimi found a broken ukulele, just one string still hanging on it. The woman said he could keep it. That battered, almost useless instrument became his first teacher. Jimi didn't learn to play by reading music or taking lessons. He taught himself, string by string, note by note, by ear. He listened to Elvis Presley records and mimicked what he heard. No one showed him how, he simply felt it out, instinct leading the way. After his mother's death, something inside Jimi shifted. His father, sensing the change, finally bought him a real guitar, a cheap second-hand acoustic. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It opened a door. Jimi threw himself into music completely, often losing hours practicing in his bedroom, chasing sounds in his mind that others couldn't hear. He was drawn to the raw emotion of the blues, the rebellious spirit of early rock and roll. He absorbed everything, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, and made it his own. Every free moment he had was spent with that guitar. It wasn't a hobby, it was survival. School, by contrast, felt empty to him. By 1959, at just 17, Jimi dropped out of Garfield High School. There were no backup plans. Music was his only way forward. He began playing with local bands like the Velvetones and the Rocking Kings. Money was scarce. Gigs were inconsistent. Some nights he slept in abandoned cars. Other nights he went hungry, but he never stopped playing. He studied other performers closely, stealing moves and making them his own. He saw guitarist Butch Snipes play with his teeth and immediately started doing it too. Not for gimmick, but to give the crowd something unforgettable. Those years of grinding, struggling, and living on the edge weren't wasted. They were shaping something bigger. In the crucible of hardship, a revolutionary sound was being born, one that would soon rewrite the rules of music forever. By 1961, Jimi Hendrix found himself at a crossroads. Trouble had been building for a while. He was restless, broke, and getting into the wrong kinds of situations. When he was caught riding in a stolen car, the court gave him a harsh choice: face prison time or join the United States Army. For a young man with no real path, it didn't feel like much of a choice at all. Jimi enlisted and found himself assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, the famed Screaming Eagles, the same unit that had parachuted into Normandy during World War II. To many, it was a badge of honor. To Jimi, it felt more like a cage. Basic training at Fort Ord in California was the first hurdle. Jimi completed it, but he struggled with the rigid structure and endless drills. Authority was something he had never respected, and military life demanded full submission. It wasn't long before the cracks started to show. In letters home to his father, Jimi wrote about his growing frustration. He hated the discipline, the early mornings, the endless routines that left little room for creativity. But there was one thing that kept him grounded: his guitar, a red Danelectro he lovingly named Betty Jean after a former girlfriend. Whenever he could steal a moment, Jimi played. In that uniform, surrounded by the machinery of war, music remained his secret rebellion. It was during this chapter that Jimi met a young bassist named Billy Cox. Both stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, they bonded instantly over their shared love of rhythm and blues. Their friendship would become one of the most important relationships of Jimi's life. Together, they formed a band called the King Casuals. They played for fellow soldiers and at local clubs whenever they could sneak away. It wasn't just for fun. It was survival. Playing music kept Jimi connected to who he really was, even as the army tried to mold him into something else. But military life never fit him. Jimi was constantly written up for missed bed checks, sleeping through shifts, and poor performance in physical training. His superiors considered him unreliable. Some reports even suggested he showed behavioral issues that, at the time, were used as grounds for discharge. After only 13 months, Jimi's time in the Army came to an end. Officially, the paperwork said it was due to an ankle injury he suffered during a parachute jump, one of the 26 jumps he completed while training to be a paratrooper. But anyone who knew him understood the deeper truth. Jimi Hendrix was never meant to follow orders. He was meant to break them. With his honorable discharge in hand, Jimi walked away from the Army for good. He didn't leave with medals or fanfare. What he carried instead was something far more valuable: a friendship with Billy Cox, a pocket full of dreams, and a growing fire inside that told him the world still hadn't heard what he had to say. The end of his military service marked a familiar pattern in Jimi's life. When the walls closed in, he found a way to tear them down. The Army had tried to clip his wings, but all it really did was remind him that he was born to fly free. After leaving the Army behind, Jimi Hendrix stepped into a world that was just as unforgiving: the brutal, beautiful reality of life as a working musician. There was no instant stardom waiting for him. Instead, he was thrown straight into the grind of the Chitlin Circuit, a network of clubs and theaters across the South, Midwest, and East Coast, where black performers could find work during segregation. The conditions were rough. Long nights, endless travel, and crowds that could turn on you if you didn't deliver something electric. Sometimes a night's pay wasn't cash. It was a plate of food, or enough gas money to get to the next town. Hotels were often segregated, and sleeping in the back seat of a broken-down car wasn't uncommon. But Jimi didn't complain. He lived for the chance to play, even if it meant playing second fiddle. He started off backing bigger names: Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Curtis Knight, Ike, and Tina Turner. These were seasoned pros who demanded perfection. Jimi was there to fill the background, not to shine. He was expected to stay in his lane, play the parts exactly as told, and never outshine the main act. But Jimi couldn't help himself. On stage, he began sneaking in his own flavor, bending notes, adding unexpected flourishes, pushing the music into wild new directions. He studied every great guitarist he came across and took their best tricks. One night, he watched a player strum the guitar with his teeth. Jimi didn't just copy it, he perfected it, turning it into a signature move. He taught himself how to play behind his back, between his legs, even upside down. Anything to grab attention, to make sure nobody forgot him. Off stage, though, his showmanship rubbed some people the wrong way. Band leaders saw him as a risk, a sideman who wanted to steal the spotlight. Jimi was fired more than once for doing too much. Little Richard, in particular, didn't appreciate Jimi's wild outfits and flamboyant playing. Richard was the star, and he wasn't about to share the stage. Still, every firing was a lesson. Every missed paycheck was a reminder. Jimi was building something bigger than any gig could offer. He was developing a style that wasn't just about technical skill, it was about raw emotion, spectacle, and soul. It was about giving the audience something they couldn't see or hear anywhere else. By 1964, after years of grinding away in smoky bars and tiny clubs, Jimi was tired of standing in the background. He had spent long enough following other people's rules, living under their lights. Now, he wanted his own spotlight. He knew he had more to offer than backup chords and silent solos. He knew it was time to step forward, or risk disappearing altogether. Music had always been survival for Jimi Hendrix, but now it was something even bigger. It was his voice, his identity, his future. And he was ready to gamble everything to make the world listen. By 1966, New York City had become Jimi Hendrix's playground and his battleground. Broke, determined, and almost invisible in the crowded Greenwich Village scene, he played anywhere he could. Clubs, coffee houses, back alley bars. One of his regular spots was Café Wah, a tiny but legendary venue where dreamers and drifters came to chase their shot at greatness. Night after night, Jimi unleashed his furious sound to audiences that barely noticed. But every solo, every stomp on his battered guitar pushed him closer to something bigger. His name around town was Jimi James, and he fronted a scrappy little group called the Blue Flames. The gigs didn't pay much. Sometimes he didn't even have enough for food. But he played like the world was already watching. One night, fate finally showed up. Chaz Chandler, former bassist of The Animals, wandered into Café Wah, looking for something new, something that could turn the page on his own career. What he found instead was a young guitarist setting fire to the very idea of what a live show could be. The moment Chandler saw Jimi perform, he knew he had found something different. This wasn't just talent, it was magic. A raw, untamed brilliance that couldn't be taught or faked. Chandler approached Jimi after the set and made a bold offer. Come to London, start fresh, build something real. Jimi didn't hesitate. He barely had money for the flight, barely had anything to pack. But on September 24, 1966, carrying little more than a cheap guitar and a pocket full of hope, Jimi Hendrix boarded a plane bound for a city that was about to change his life forever.
Something else was happening across
London
the country.
in the mid-60s was a boiling pot of sound and style, and Hendrix fit right into its wild heart. Chandler wasted no time. He helped Jimi form a new band, hand-picking musicians who could match his fire. Noel Redding was brought in on bass, a guitar player willing to switch instruments just to be part of the ride. Mitch Mitchell, a jazz-influenced powerhouse, took up the drums. Together, they became the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The chemistry was instant, and so was the buzz. London's music scene, always hungry for the next big thing, couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Here was a man who played guitar like it was an extension of his soul. Fluid, ferocious, and completely unpredictable. Word spread fast. At a Cream concert shortly after arriving, Jimi asked if he could sit in. The band, thinking little of it, handed him a guitar. What followed left everyone speechless. Jimi tore through a version of Killing Floor, so electrifying that Eric Clapton, one of the gods of the British blues scene, reportedly walked off stage to collect himself, stunned by what he had just witnessed. The old guard had been put on notice. A new force had arrived. In a matter of weeks, Jimi Hendrix went from unknown sideman to the most talked-about musician in London. Every major star, from McCartney to Jagger, came to see him play. And none left disappointed. The boy who once slept in the back seats of broken cars was now at the center of the most exciting music scene on the planet. But for Jimi Hendrix, this was just the beginning. The real revolution was only getting started. The first spark came with a simple song, Hey Joe. It wasn't a Hendrix original, but the way he played it made it completely his own. In late 1966, with his new band locked in and his confidence soaring, Jimi stepped into the studio and recorded his first single in London. It wasn't smooth. The amps were too loud for the tiny studio, and Jimi, never completely comfortable with his singing voice, second-guessed every take. But when the final mix was done, Chandler knew they had captured lightning. Jimi's guitar wept, screamed, and bled through every note. Released in December 1966, Hey Joe climbed steadily up the British charts. By early 1967, it had broken into the top 10. Just months earlier, Jimi had been a complete unknown. Now, he was a name every serious musician in London was whispering about. But records alone weren't enough. Jimi wasn't just about sound. He was about spectacle. And the world was about to witness exactly what that meant. In June 1967, Jimi Hendrix took the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival in California. It was a festival packed with talent. Janis Joplin, The Who, Otis Redding. But Jimi wasn't content to blend in. He was determined to leave a mark that no one could forget. Before his set, he whispered to a stagehand to get him some lighter fluid. He had a plan. Something wild. Something symbolic. After a furious, soul-bending performance, Jimi reached the climax of his set with Wild Thing. He knelt down, doused his guitar in lighter fluid, and set it ablaze. As the flames roared up, Jimi smashed the guitar into pieces, feeding the fire like a sacrifice to the gods of rock and roll. The crowd stood frozen, jaws open, cameras flashed. In that one act, Jimi Hendrix didn't just play a show. He changed the very idea of what live music could be. The images of Hendrix on his knees before the burning guitar raced around the world. Overnight, he wasn't just a promising guitarist, he was a phenomenon. The kid who once played on the streets for spare change was now the most electrifying figure in music. Off the back of that moment, Jimi released his debut album, Are You Experienced? It hit like a tidal wave. In the UK, it climbed to number 2 on the charts, only held back by the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. In America, the album slowly took hold, fueled by the counterculture, spreading by word of mouth, and igniting the underground FM radio scene. The songs were unlike anything people had ever heard. Purple Haze, Manic Depression, The Wind Cries Mary. Each track was a window into another world, a fusion of blues, rock, soul, and something otherworldly that only Jimi could summon. The sounds bent reality. Guitars sounded like spaceships, dreams, nightmares, all crashing together in beautiful chaos. Critics didn't even have the right language yet to describe what he was doing. They simply knew something new had arrived. Are You Experienced wasn't just an album. It was a blueprint for the future of music. And at the center of it all was Jimi Hendrix, a man who had traveled from battered ukuleles to burning Stratocasters, from the shadows of poverty to the spotlight of history, all by trusting the voice inside him that said, "Keep going." And now, the world was listening. By 1968, Jimi Hendrix was no longer just a rising star. He was a creative force that couldn't be contained. But with fame came pressure, and Jimi felt it closing in. He wanted more control, more space to chase the sounds only he could hear. That need for freedom led him to take a bold step. For the first time, he would produce his own album. The result was Electric Ladyland, a sprawling double LP that shattered expectations. It was messy, brilliant, chaotic, and pure. Unlike the tight, carefully structured songs of his debut, this was a universe without borders. Tracks like Voodoo Child, Slight Return, and Crosstown Traffic showed his ferocity, while his haunting cover of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower revealed new emotional depths. The sessions, though, were anything but smooth. Jimi obsessed over every detail, often recording dozens of takes of a single part. He layered guitars on top of guitars, chasing a vision that only he could see clearly. Band members grew frustrated. Friends drifted away. But Jimi pressed forward, determined to capture the full scope of what was in his mind. That mind, by now, was deeply shaped by psychedelics. LSD had become a regular part of his life, opening strange doors in his consciousness. Jimi spoke often of visions, landscapes of sound, cosmic journeys, colors and shapes that had no names. He tried to explain them to others, but most couldn't understand. So he let the music do the talking. The influence of acid wasn't just in the swirling solos or the dreamlike lyrics. It was in the way Jimi approached the entire creative process. Flowing, unpredictable, driven by instinct rather than plan. Songs like 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be, felt like journeys through underwater kingdoms or distant planets. Reality bent and twisted under the weight of his imagination. But the cost of that vision was steep. The long recording hours, the endless retakes, the atmosphere of constant experimentation. It all wore Jimi down. He was chasing something that seemed to move farther away the closer he got. The people around him didn't always know how to keep up. Meanwhile, Jimi's spending was spiraling out of control. Renting studio time across New York and London drained his earnings faster than he could refill them. He needed a place of his own, a sanctuary where he could create without limits. That dream became Electric Lady Studios. With the help of his manager, Michael Jeffrey, Jimi bought the Old Generation Club in Greenwich Village. He hired top designers and architects to build a recording studio unlike any other, one made for artists, not just engineers. The walls would curve, the lights would glow soft and inviting. The entire space would breathe creativity. But construction quickly became a nightmare. Delays piled up. Costs doubled, then tripled. What was supposed to be a quick, affordable project ballooned into $1 million sinkhole. Even as Jimi toured and packed arenas, the bills kept coming. Money that should have secured his future was pouring into bricks, paint, and wiring. Still, for a little while, the dream survived. In the summer of 1970, just months before his death, Jimi finally stepped into Electric Lady Studios and recorded some of his last new music. For those few moments, he had exactly what he always wanted. A space where the music could flow freely, where the visions in his mind could finally find their voice. By the end of the 1960s, the bright flame Jimi Hendrix had lit was beginning to flicker under the weight of its own intensity. The world saw the genius, the showman, the wild spirit. But behind the stage lights, Jimi was struggling to keep it all together. The road never stopped. Neither did the temptations. What started as casual drug use had become a constant blur of LSD, marijuana, amphetamines, and increasingly, alcohol. At first, the substances seemed to fuel his creativity, unlocking new doors in his mind. But over time, they began locking him inside his own chaos. Alcohol hit Jimi differently. Friends said that the easygoing, dreamy guitarist became someone else when he drank. Angry, volatile, unpredictable. Some nights it was harmless. Other nights it led to fights, broken furniture, shattered relationships. The cracks widened in May 1969 when Jimi flew into Toronto for a show. At the airport, customs officials searched his luggage and found small quantities of heroin and hashish. Jimi insisted the drugs weren't his, and many around him believed someone had planted them. But it didn't matter. He was arrested and charged with drug possession. If convicted, he faced up to 20 years in prison. The timing couldn't have been worse. His band was fracturing, his energy was draining, and now he was fighting for his freedom. When Jimi took the stage that night at Maple Leaf Gardens, he tried to hide the weight on his shoulders. During Red House, he changed the lyrics mid-song. "Soon as I get out of jail, I want to see her." It was part joke, part cry for help. The trial stretched on through the year. Jimi had to cut his hair, wear suits, and play the part of a respectable citizen. In December, after tense days of testimony, the jury found him not guilty. He walked out of the courtroom smiling, flashing a peace sign. For a moment, it seemed like he had escaped the spiral, but the damage was deeper than legal trouble. His body was exhausted, his mind was fraying, and the machine around him, the managers, the agents, the endless demands, never stopped. Amid all this, Jimi still managed one of the most unforgettable moments of his career. In August 1969, he took the stage at Woodstock, a festival that became the symbol of an entire generation's hopes and disillusionment. Scheduled to headline Sunday night, delays pushed Jimi's set to Monday morning. By the time he stepped on stage, most of the massive crowd had drifted away, worn down by rain and exhaustion. Only around 30,000 people remained, a fraction of the original numbers. None of that mattered. What came next was pure history. Near the end of his set, Jimi began playing The Star-Spangled Banner. But this wasn't a respectful cover. His guitar screamed with the sounds of bombs, machine guns, and sirens. It was the national anthem torn apart and rebuilt through the lens of the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and the American soul itself. Some called it disrespectful. Others called it a masterpiece. Jimi said it was just what he felt inside, a mirror of the times he was living through. Whether he meant it as protest or not, it became one of the most iconic performances in rock history. But no amount of glory on stage could fix what was happening off it. His relationships with bandmates Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell were falling apart. Tours felt endless. Recording sessions dragged on for months without focus. Jimi was caught between the demands of fame and the need to find peace, and it was tearing him in two. The man who had once burned his guitar as a symbol of rebirth was now burning out for real, and there was no easy way back. By the fall of 1970, Jimi Hendrix was a man running on fumes. The endless touring, the lawsuits, the broken relationships, it all weighed heavily on him. Friends said he looked tired, thinner, like the light inside him was starting to dim. His music still soared, but behind closed doors, Jimi seemed lost. In September, he flew to London for a series of shows and meetings. On the night of September 17th, he was staying with his girlfriend Monica Danneman at the Samarkand Hotel. They spent the evening drinking wine, talking about the future, trying to make plans that always seemed just out of reach. At some point in the early morning hours, Jimi took 9 Vesperac sleeping pills, 18 times the normal dose. Whether he understood how strong they were is still a mystery. Monica later claimed he was having trouble sleeping and just wanted rest. But nothing about that night has ever added up cleanly. By the time paramedics arrived the next morning, the scene was grim. Jimi was found unconscious, lying on a bed, his airway blocked by vomit. Red wine soaked the sheets and his clothing. There was no clear sign of struggle, just an overwhelming sense of sadness. Monica told authorities she had only left briefly to get cigarettes. Yet witnesses recalled gaps in her story and timelines that didn't match. Doctors at St. Mary Abbott's Hospital fought to revive him, but it was too late. At 12:45 p.m. on September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix was pronounced dead. He was just 27 years old. In the days that followed, the world mourned. Fans gathered outside the hotel, clutching guitars and flowers. Tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. But the questions never stopped. How could someone so full of life, so fiercely creative, be gone so suddenly? Why had Monica waited so long to call for help? Was it really just an accident? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? In 1992, fueled by years of rumor and doubt, Scotland Yard quietly reopened the investigation. New witnesses were interviewed. Old files were reviewed. Some suggested Jimi had been forcibly given the pills. Others whispered about business disputes and bad deals that had spiraled out of control. But when the case was closed again in 1993, no new charges were filed. No clear answers were found. To this day, the true story of Jimi Hendrix's death remains clouded by mystery, tangled in conflicting accounts and half-remembered truths. What's certain is that the world lost more than just a brilliant musician. It lost a voice that had only begun to explore its full power. With his passing, Jimi joined the infamous 27 Club, a group of artists, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Brian Jones, and later Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse, who all died at the same age. The coincidences haunted fans and historians alike. It was as if a generation's brightest lights were destined to burn out far too soon. But if death took Jimi Hendrix's body, it could never touch the music he left behind. In life, he broke every rule he encountered. In death, he became timeless, a spirit whose echoes are still felt every time a guitar bends a note toward the heavens. More than 50 years after his final bow, Jimi Hendrix's spirit burns brighter than ever. In 2025, the world isn't just remembering him, it's honoring him in ways long overdue. On March 18th, in a ceremony filled with music, memories, and emotion, the state of Washington awarded Jimi Hendrix the Medal of Merit, its highest civilian honor. Inside the Capitol building in Olympia, lawmakers, family members, and fans came together to recognize a life that reshaped the language of music. Governor Bob Ferguson called him one of the greatest innovators of all time, a homegrown legend whose influence stretched far beyond the borders of Seattle, far beyond the reach of any single era. As the applause faded in Olympia, stages across America were waking up to something even bigger. The Experience Hendrix Tour, silenced for years by the pandemic, returned at full force in 2025. It's more than a tribute show, it's a living, breathing celebration of a man who changed what it meant to make music. Night after night, a powerhouse lineup takes the stage, each artist adding their own voice to Jimi's songs. Kenny Wayne Shepherd, Zakk Wylde, Eric Johnson, Marcus King, Samantha Fish, Devon Allman, Christone Kingfish Ingram, each one standing tall, yet bowing their heads in respect to the giant whose shoulders they stand on. But the most powerful moment is yet to come. On April 12th, the tour's final show lands in Atlanta at the legendary Fox Theater. That night, blues icon Buddy Guy, at 88 years old and fresh out of retirement, returns to the spotlight for one last performance. A moment heavy with meaning. Buddy isn't just a blues legend. He's one of the few living artists Jimi Hendrix openly called an influence, a teacher. Their paths first crossed in smoky New York clubs back in the late 60s, long before either realized the full weight of their legacies. Now, decades later, Buddy steps on stage to honor a friend who once gazed at him with wide, hungry eyes, soaking up every riff, every note. When Buddy plugs in his guitar and bends that first soulful note, it's more than music. It's a conversation across time, a reminder that in every young guitarist, every wild solo, every fearless experiment, Jimi Hendrix still lives. As the final chords echo into the rafters, the message is clear. Jimi never really left. His fingerprints are all over modern music, from rock to blues, funk to hip-hop. His spirit continues to inspire dreamers, rebels, and anyone daring enough to pick up a guitar and chase a sound only they can hear. The world has changed 1,000 times since Jimi's days on stage. But his fire, that bold, beautiful fire, has never gone out. It dances every time a crowd holds its breath for a solo, every time a young player steps into the unknown, every time music refuses to fit inside a box. Because Jimi Hendrix didn't just play the guitar, he made it speak.